There was a time, not that long ago, when you couldn't drive more than a few miles across Britain without seeing one. The boxy front, the bold lettering, and that unmistakable growl of a Bedford lorry. From bustling city centres to the muddy corners of rural Yorkshire, Bedford trucks were the heartbeat of British haulage. Milk, mail, coal, concrete, you name it, Bedford moved it. They weren't flashy, they weren't exotic, but they were everywhere, and now practically vanished. So what actually happened? To understand their fall, you've got to look back at their rise. Bedford was born out of Vauxhall Motors, which was already deep in the British car scene when the 1930s rolled around. But when General Motors stepped in and gave Vauxhall the green light to build lorries under a new name, Bedford was born. And from day one, they weren't messing about. These trucks were designed to be simple, strong, and suited to the working class businesses of Britain. No unnecessary frills, just reliability, mile after mile. During World War II, Bedford became a lifeline for the military. The QL and OY models were churned out by the thousands, ferrying troops, fuel, and gear across bombed-out roads in Europe. They proved their toughness in battle, and when the war ended, that reputation carried over to peacetime industry. Farmers, builders, posties, everyone wanted a Bedford, and Bedford delivered, literally and figuratively. Through the 1950s and 60s, they were everywhere. The iconic TK became one of the most widely used commercial trucks in the country. It wasn't just a lorry, it was a symbol of a hard-working Britain. But success has a strange way of making you slow down. While Bedford was dominating the roads at home, something was changing in the rest of Europe. Over on the continent, companies like Mercedes-Benz, Volvo, and Scania were refining their trucks. Better cabs, more powerful engines, and smoother gearboxes. They weren't just building trucks anymore. They were building tools that made drivers' lives easier. And while Britain had loyalty to Bedford, loyalty only goes so far when the job gets tougher and the rivals keep getting better. By the 1970s, cracks were starting to show. The world was modernizing, and Bedford, it felt like they were stuck in yesterday. The trucks still did the job, but they were beginning to feel dated. Other brands were offering better comfort, better fuel economy, and better performance. Meanwhile, Bedford seemed to be relying on the goodwill of tradition. Then came the knockout blow. The market shifted, and it wasn't gradual. Suddenly, European trucks were flooding into the UK, and hauliers started crunching the numbers. A used Scania with a few thousand miles on the clock was offering more reliability than a brand new Bedford. And once the big players switched, the small fleets followed. The image of Bedford, once the proud workhorse of Britain, was now looking like a tired old nag. It hurt, especially for those who'd built their livelihoods on Bedford steel. Behind the scenes, General Motors, still the parent company, didn't seem all that interested in giving Bedford the investment it desperately needed. While other manufacturers were innovating, Bedford was barely holding on. Their TL range in the 80s was decent, but it wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't enough to win back the market. And in business, good enough just isn't good enough. By the late 1980s, Bedford was in trouble. GM decided to offload the truck division, and in 1987, they sold it off to AWD, a company that aimed to keep the name alive through military and export contracts. But that was never going to recapture the magic. It was a slow fade. By the mid-90s, production had fizzled out, and Bedford, once the king of Britain's roads, was gone. But here's the twist. Even though Bedford lorries disappeared from forecourts and factories, they never truly vanished from memory. Some are still out there, lovingly restored, preserved in museums, or spotted in vintage runs, proudly puffing down B-roads with a coat of fresh paint and the unmistakable rumble of old-school engineering. They spark conversations, they bring back stories, and for many, they represent a time when British haulage was less about high-tech gadgets and more about heart, grit, and a name you could trust. The thing about Bedford trucks is, they got under your skin. Maybe it was the simplicity, maybe it was the noise, that deep, loyal clatter that let you know you were on the move. Or maybe it was just the fact they never pretended to be anything other than what they were, solid working-class machines that didn't need chrome to earn respect. And even after Bedford shut up shop, the legacy didn't just vanish into scrapyards and auction lots. It stayed alive in back roads and builders' yards, in memory and in metal. There was something about the TK that made it unforgettable. It was the kind of truck that was just everywhere. Fire brigades ran them, the military loved them, farmers swore by them, and even now, you'll find blokes in their 60s who will point to one and go, "That was my first lorry." It didn't matter if it was hauling hay, milk, or army kit. The TK did it all, and it had that face, That unmistakable flat cab with round headlamps and a sort of quiet confidence built into the steel. It looked like it belonged on a postcard from post-war Britain. Then there was the KM, the heavier duty sibling. That thing could shift serious weight, and yet it was still easy enough to handle with a bit of skill and a strong left leg. Bedford even dabbled in international markets: Australia, the Middle East, Africa. In places where tarmac was optional and breakdowns meant real trouble, Bedford trucks kept grinding it out. They weren't posh, but they were dependable, and in the end, that's what made them valuable. But when Bedford folded, there wasn't really anyone rushing in to preserve the name. No huge campaign to bring it back. No major manufacturer snapping up the rights for a revival. It just drifted. It's almost poetic, the brand that once moved Britain, slowly getting left behind by the very progress it helped create. But not everyone forgot. Enthusiasts started picking them up. Collectors brought the TKs and TLs back to life, carefully restoring the paintwork, tracking down parts from scrapyards and surplus stockpiles. Some even got a modern twist, swapped engines, upgraded electrics, giving Bedford a second life, blending nostalgia with practicality. And there's a reason they're so popular at vintage truck shows. It's not just the look, though that classic Bedford grille does turn heads. It's the feeling. You stand next to one and it's like stepping into a time warp. You remember the smell of diesel in the morning, the rattle of the cab as you took off down a frosty road, the crackle of a CB radio in the dark. It's a kind of romanticism that only comes with machines that earned their place in history the hard way. Now, in a world full of driverless tech, automated fleets, and all the bells and whistles of modern logistics, Bedford reminds people of when the job was simpler, not easier, but more grounded. Back then, it was about gut instinct and muscle memory. No digital torque readings, no fancy lane assist, just you, the truck, and the road ahead. And if something went wrong, you didn't call a dealer, you rolled up your sleeves, pulled out a spanner, and fixed it yourself. That's the Bedford legacy. And while the brand itself may be long gone from new production, it still casts a long shadow. Look at any independent haulier who came up in the 70s or 80s, and 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you they started out in a Bedford, they learned the ropes in those cabs, they built their careers on the back of those axles. So when people say Bedford died out, that's only half the truth. The company might have closed its doors, but the spirit, that no-nonsense, get-the-job-done attitude, never left. In a way, Bedford didn't fail. It was just outpaced, outfunded, outmarketed, but never outclassed in heart. And that's why, decades later, people still ask, what happened to Bedford? Because you don't ask that about something forgettable. You ask that about something important, something that matters. So next time you're on the road and you catch sight of an old Bedford TK, maybe rusting quietly behind a barn or rolling into a vintage meet with a fresh polish, give it a second look. That's not just an old truck. That's a piece of British grit on wheels. And like all true legends, it might be quiet now, but it will never truly disappear.